I wanted to show you guys this painting from the very beginning and just to show you guys what I do to start out a painting. And as you can see, I've got it all laid out. And here's the masking that I'm going to use. It's Winsor & Newton, and it is removable masking, so that's important to take note of because they do make permanent masking, and you don't want to make the mistake of buying permanent masking and then you can't get it off. So make sure you buy removable masking to use it at least the way I do, which is to apply it, paint over it, let the painting dry, and then remove it. And so I'm pouring it into my little holder here, just a tiny little bit. You really don't need a lot. And in the other container, I have a little bit of soap. Okay, so here I'm using a rigger brush. You don't want to leave the masking in the brush too long, because if you do, then the brushes will, the masking will dry in the brushes and ruin the brushes. You just won't be able to use them at all for anything. I've also had it leak out onto my clothes in my luggage, and it totally ruins the clothes. You just can't get it out. It's like plastic that then dries within the fibers of whatever it's in and completely ruins it. So here I am getting my brush nice and soapy. And I'm making a nice little point because I'm going to do either whiskers or a little spot in the dog's eye. And then I'm just getting a little bit of masking on the very tip of my brush. You don't want to have globs of masking, obviously, if you're doing fine little details with the masking. And I'm just going to make the little glistening white areas in the eyes that make them look so wet, and a few little highlights along the edges of the eyes. You want to make sure that every couple minutes you re-wash out your brush, put more soap on it, and then get fresh masking, because I don't trust the soap. So it's just an extra cautionary level to use the soap, but I still wouldn't let the masking sit on your brush too long. You still want to rinse out your brush every minute or so and get fresh soap and fresh masking on your brush. Here I'm showing you just how much soap I rub into the paintbrush, quite a bit. It will not affect how your masking works. At least it hasn't for me. And then I'm making a nice fine little point so I can get the details I want with the masking. And then I dip it in the masking like so. Doesn't take much. You can see I have a very small little bit to keep the details refined. I'm just putting in the details of this eye. Okay, and then I'm just going to do a few little glistens of light white areas on the nose right here. And here I'm going to do some whiskers, just some very delicate small little whiskers. If you overdo it with the masking, it will look stilted. You don't want to use any more masking than is necessary. Only use it for small little details. Some artists use it in a different way, but for me, it just takes so much work at the end of the painting to scrub out those edges that look so stilted after you take the masking off. And almost every single time I use masking, there's still areas of masking that I ask myself, why did I put masking here? Because this is just causing me more work. Whereas I could have just scrubbed it out adequately enough to get lighter areas. So just keep that in mind. Really, it's best just for using for whiskers and little glints of light on the eyes. And I'm just really using a very light touch here to get the whiskers done. And rinse out that brush. Good job, Rach. Rinse out that brush. Otherwise, you will have a mess. Okay, so I thought it would be neat to show you guys my palette and what I do. The first step, of course, is to really get some nice puddles of color on your palette. So that's what I'm doing here. This is burnt sienna, and I'm just getting a bunch of burnt sienna. It's a pretty wet puddle, and the first layer that I'm going to do is just kind of the background lighter layer, so it doesn't have to be so concentrated. So it's about the thickness of, I'd say, maybe thick tea or skim milk. I don't know, probably skim milk, right? Okay, so this is some ultramarine blue. I'm gonna get my ultramarine blue, and I just like this mixture so much. It's just my go-to. I keep going back to it because I like how it granulates and makes soft fur textures, and also you can go back into it and really scrub it out, and it scrubs out nicely, which means it is not a staining watercolor combination. Ultramarine and burnt sienna are both pretty granular, and they're pretty good about lifting out, which is often good when you want to get soft little details in the animal's face or wherever you're working in the fur. Okay. So the next step, of course, is to get the background of the dog wet where I want to put my very first fresh little layer. And one thing you guys want to try to remember, and I could have done a better job of this actually in this painting, I could have done a few different hues in the background and made it less flat, but I still think it worked for this dog. But anyway, like one brush full you want to have more ultramarine, then less sienna, and then the next sienna and ultramarine, and just vary your colors in the background a little bit just to add some interest. You don't ever want to use just one solid color, and very rarely do you want to use a pure color of anything because it'll just look too flat and blah. You want to add some interest and make it kind of stand out. So here I'm just adding pretty drippy water, really, because the other thing to keep in mind is as you wet your background, other areas that you wetted are going to dry. So you want to get it pretty wet so that by the time you're ready to load your brush up with paint and put the paint on, it hasn't dried out too much. So especially the first bit of the painting that you get wet, it's going to be pretty wet. Pretty glistening. So you definitely have to practice with this and figure out what works best for you and your style, but that's just what works for me. So I'm loading up my little brush. I should use a larger brush than what I'm using. This is about a size 5 or 6 sable hair brush here that I'm loading up on my palette. As you see, I'm mixing that burnt sienna and ultramarine together, and it makes just the perfect color for this hound dog that I'm working on. This is a coon hound. It's a commission that I did, and by the time this video comes out, it has already been delivered to the owner, and she was very excited. It was a gift from another one of her friends. So anyway, here we go. I'm putting down that first layer, and as you can see, I changed my mind. I was like, oop, I need a bigger brush. So you want to use as big a brush as you can get away with, usually in whatever area you're painting. See, you can see the paper is already dried right up there in the left upper corner. So I like to work a little bit more wet than that, so I could have gotten it even more wet. And there I go. I put a little bit more burnt sienna, a little bit more blue, just to vary the color a little bit. And I'm just going to continue to lay in the lighter background, and after I do this, I hopefully won't have to go back into this background much at all. So I can get this all washed in, and that part of the painting will mostly be done. Okay, and then I'm going to get a thicker bit of paint on my brush, and I'm going to drop these ears in while this the paper's still wet, because I want a soft edge there on this ear. I don't want there to be a hard edge. I don't want it to be the center of attention. I just want to I want it to kind of fade off into the background. I don't want it to be the center of interest, so that's why I'm painting this ear in, at least in this first stage, wet and wet, because I want a nice soft edge so that it is not screaming, ear, look at me, because ultimately I really want the viewer to be drawn into those eyes, of course. So that's why I kept this really wet, and I'm working on the ears and making them very dark, hopefully, so I will not have to rework them very much at all. The more dark tones that you can get done during this first wet stage, the better, because it'll all just meld together and look softer and more natural if you can do that. And eventually you'll run out of time and you'll have to let it completely dry before you go on to do your next layer. But if you can work quickly, that would be good. And you can see that I'm trying to pay attention to parts of the ear that are cooler and parts of the ear that are warmer. For warmer areas, it's more burnt sienna. For more cooler areas, it is more ultramarine. And there I'm dropping in some water right there to push that dark color back into the ear. The water can be dropped onto the paper and kind of, you can think of it as pushing back into the color to kind of define your boundaries, but they're soft boundaries. And for fur, that actually often works really well, because it'll make really interesting little textures between the fur and the background, and it'll make it look furry and soft and fuzzy instead of this hard edge that would never actually happen between fur and background. So that's something to keep in mind, to try to keep everything soft and to attach your subject to the background. That's another way to do it. I do that a lot. I drop in pure clean water against a dark area to have it push into the dark area, to push the dark area back. And you just have to keep reworking it while it's really wet, and just tweak it as it's wet, because of course once it's dry, your only option is to go back in and scrub it, which is okay. That can look good too, but you really can get some really neat effects if you can do it while it's really wet. So I'm just putting in some more details of this ear and trying to get as many details in this really wet stage.